Marijuana. You can't own a gun. That's what the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms says in a memo issued to gun dealers. But is this fair? Joining us now to debate this is former ATF director himself, Mike Sullivan, and Steve Fox. He's the director of government relations for the Medical Marijuana Policy Project. Nice to see both of you this morning. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Good morning, Clayton.
Steve, let me start with you. Why do you have a problem with this?
Where to begin? I mean, we have a situation where the ATF is making this decision and forcing patients to make a terrible choice, which is to either use the medicine that they need to alleviate their pain legally under state law, or abandon their Second Amendment rights to bear arms and protect their families. This is a choice that no other patients are forced to make, and it's unfair that medical marijuana patients are being forced to make it.
Mike, what about that point that in other situations where medicine is administered to patients, they don't have to make this choice between owning a firearm and taking their medicine?
Well, that's not exactly true, but the point that Steve is making is that suggesting that ATF is putting them in that position is false. ATF is following the Gun Control Act, which indicates that anybody who's unlawfully using or addicted to any controlled substance is prohibited from purchasing a firearm. And the last time I looked, marijuana is still listed as a controlled substance by the two principal federal agencies, the FDA and DEA, and it's still a federal crime to essentially cultivate, possess, or distribute marijuana. So ATF is in compliance with the Gun Control Act, and they're responding to inquiries from gun dealers that they have a tremendous partnership and relationship with. Gun dealers want to know, what do they do when somebody presents a medical marijuana card?
Well, and Steve, Mike brings up a great point. You know, these gun dealers are put in an awkward situation because they're having to make these decisions sort of on a case-by-case basis. Here's what the ATF has written to the federal firearms licensees, and they say this: any person who uses or is addicted to medical marijuana or marijuana, regardless of whether or not his or her state has passed legislation authorizing marijuana use for medical purposes, is an unlawful user of or is addicted to a controlled substance and is prohibited by federal law from possessing firearms or ammunition. Steve, it seems sort of cut and dry.
Yeah, well, it really isn't, because the federal government has looked at this situation. You have the Department of Justice saying that U.S. attorneys aren't going to make a priority of going after individual users. You've had the Veterans Administration issue a policy that allows people to use medical marijuana and remain on their treatment regimen. And the ATF could have done the same thing. And the truth is, if the ATF is going in this direction, then your viewers should be in touch with the NRA if they're members, because the next thing they could do is just determine their definition of addiction and make it so that anyone using a prescription drug over an extended period of time can own a gun.
Mike, you shaking your head?
No, I think that's completely unfair and unreasonable. ATF can't on their own determine and interpret Congress's intent. Congress passed the Gun Control Act. If Steve has an issue with it, Steve should be lobbying Congress to essentially have exceptions as it relates to medical marijuana, to see whether or not there's an appetite within Congress to allow those people that are using marijuana with or without prescription cards to be able to purchase firearms. It's unfair to fault ATF to doing what Congress has asked them to do.
Steve?
Yeah, there's room for interpretation here. One court has looked at the definition of unlawful user and have said that it needs to be constant use or regular use over an extended period of time. And the mere possession of a medical marijuana card doesn't on its own say that you are a continual unlawful user. And more needs to be done by the ATF. They can't have this blanket policy.
Steve, what about law enforcement here in this situation? I mean, you know, we hear from law enforcement officials on a regular basis. I mean, you're impaired. Your judgment is impaired when you're using marijuana. You wouldn't want these individuals behind the wheel of a car. Why should they be handling a gun?
Well, you certainly wouldn't. But the truth is that all kinds of prescription medications impair judgment at times. Certainly the use of alcohol impairs judgment at times. But we can't just have this blanket policy. They have this policy for unlawful users, and it needs to be understood that the states have determined that in these states it is legal use of the drug. There may be inconsistency between state and federal law, but there is room for the ATF to understand this and determine that lawful use under state law should be considered lawful use.
Mike, you're shaking your head.
ATF does not have the discretion to do that. This is not a policy by ATF, and Steve knows that. This is a federal statute. It's called the Gun Control Act. When you look at the Gun Control Act, it has language in there about unlawful use of controlled substance. Steve's beef is not with ATF. ATF does an excellent job in terms of partnering with gun dealers to make sure that the Gun Control Act is properly enforced.
Steve, who's your
beef with? The Gun Control Act says unlawful uses.
Yeah, no, my beef is, in this case, with the ATF. I mean, it is their interpretation, and I'm serious in the fact that the same statute says an unlawful user or someone addicted to any controlled substance. And if they want to make this interpretation, they can just as easily say that anyone who has an ongoing prescription to OxyContin or perhaps any other drug is addicted to that drug, whether it's Ritalin or Lunesta or who knows what it is, but they will be addicted to a drug, and the ATF will say, we're sorry, we're going to take away your guns. And the NRA should be aware of this and should be doing something about it.
That's the last words. Mike will give you the last word.
I think Steve is trying to get the NRA to essentially embrace medical marijuana users' rights to firearms. If they want to change the law, they should change the Gun Control Act. It has nothing to do with interpretation or ATF policy. It's the language of the Gun Control Act. ATF essentially is trying to advise gun dealers in response to gun dealers' questions about marijuana users. Those people who are smoking marijuana, should they be able to purchase and possess a firearm?
All right, Mike Sullivan, Steve Fox, we appreciate a very interesting debate this morning. Thanks so much for joining us bright and early.
Thank you.
Thanks, Leighton.